Amen. Wow. We want to continue talking about the way of compassion today, which is in me little book. And we want to talk about this whole subject we've been unpackaging, compassion. What does it mean to have compassion? And how does it affect our lives? And when I started thinking about this subject about a year ago now, and started writing about it, I started asking myself, what is the keys to compassion? What are the keys to compassion? And it became really apparent in studying the scriptures that the keys to compassion lie in revelation. It lies in a deep understanding of something which you didn't understand before. And the revelation that compassion rises out of is the revelation, and we looked at this the other week, about the unity of all things. The unity of all things. When I discover that, and to the deeper my revelation of the unity of all things, the more stronger will be my compassion for all creation. The more I see myself as a separate little entity, all out there on my own, the more I'm going to not care what happens to you. Pull the ladder up, Jack. It's just I, me, and myself. And so we started looking at this, looked at the principle of non-discrimination and how everything rises out of that. And we noticed that when I recognize that I'm not separate from you, and this is what we looked at last week, when I recognize that I'm not separate from you, then I start developing the ability to listen. Do you remember we looked at that? So all the time I'm separate from you, what you have to say, I don't care. Your problems are your problems. You've got an issue, here's a tissue, sort of thing. But when I realize that your problems are my problems, that we start developing a different sense. It's a little bit like if you hit your thumb with a hammer, poor old you. If I hit my thumb with a hammer, this hand immediately drops the hammer and comes over and takes hold of the thumb. Even though this is the hand that caused the damage, because this hand recognizes that this hand is part of the same body, right? So the greater your sense of that, the more likely you are to have compassion. And you know, one of the things, if you've traveled with us in India, one of the great tragedies of leprosy is that leprosy stops that sense of feeling. And so you'd be belting your hand with a hammer and you don't recognize it. Why leprosy and sin are so often combined in the Bible. So we're going to turn to Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. We were at the hospital yesterday, and while we were at the hospital, I visited and sat with Andrew. And many of you know Andrew, Eastern European chappie, who was one of the very first people that was involved with the Sanctuary project. And Joe and I were out at about 2 o'clock in the morning in the town. We weren't partying, we were out hunting for homeless people. And we went around into this underground car park where we had heard some people were staying. And around the back of this car park was some biffa bins. And we went round the back of the biffa bins, and there was a whole bunch of people, T-Bar, and 4 or 5 people, this whole group. Those of you who work in Sanctuary will know this group. And Andrew was there. And I remember as we spoke to him, as we chatted with them, they broke down, particularly T-Bar was in tears, and we hugged him. First of all, they were very aggressive towards us because they didn't know what we were there for and what we were trying to do, whether we were there to move them on. And as we found out, they couldn't speak English, we couldn't speak their language, but they understood the universal language of the hug. That's a universal language of love, isn't it? The hug. It's a terrible shame that in our politically correct society that hugs are becoming something which you almost have to get somebody to sign on the dotted line before you're allowed to hug them. When Jo was in having her chemotherapy, there was a nurse there, a male nurse, and lovely guy, and I had just left, and we had been talking with him, and I had just left, and he was as gay as the day is long. And he was just a lovely, caring person in that ward. And he came over to see Jo, and Jo was crying. And what's his name again? And he said, "You need a Jason hug, don't you?" I said, "Yes." And he just held her and hugged her. And I thank God for that. I thank God for somebody who didn't need it written in triplicate before he did what's natural in the human heart to care for another human being. And when Tibor, he stood there and I hugged him and he held my hands. And Joe will remember this. He looked at us and he says, "I only have one life. I only have one life." And at that point, something inside me dissolved. And the barriers and the different nationalities and the language differences all dissolved. And I saw in him my pain in him, and his hope in me and my hope in him. I saw that there was a connection there. And out of that connection, we came back and said, we've got to do something about this. And Sanctuary started gaining traction. You see, when I realize deeply that I'm not separate from the naked, starving war child in a war-torn country that I can barely pronounce the name, then I start to care. That's when compassion is birthed in me. When I recognize that Christ is not separate from the least of these, then the margins becomes a place of encounter. Today we're going to talk about this aspect of compassion, which we entitled, that's the wrong slide. It should be the principle of going to the margins. Okay. But we've got the right, okay. No worries, that's fine. So it should be the principle of going to the margins. So just in your mind, you can delete that bit. But because we're not discriminating, that's okay. Going to the margins. When I recognize that Jesus is in the least of these, when I saw Jesus in Tibor, it motivated me to go to the margins. When you see Jesus in that war child, it might motivate you to try and do something about the war that's causing that problem. When you see huge displacement, it motivates you to want to be a solution to that. It raises compassion within you. Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese peace activist, he said this, and he wrote this during the Vietnam War, and he came to America to try and become, not only had he been kicked out by Vietnam, but he came to America partly to raise the awareness of all that was happening out there and to say, we are no different from you. Somehow, in order for that terrible war to happen, a different ideology between communism and capitalism had become something so much greater than a difference in ideology. And it enabled us to drop tons of napalm and Agent Orange upon that country and devastate whole villages and whole communities in the name of peace. And he wrote this, trying to encourage us to see that what we do to another is what we do to ourselves. Do not say that I'll depart tomorrow, because even today I still arrive. Look deeply. I arrive in every second to be a bud on a spring branch, to be a tiny bird with wings still fragile, learning to sing in my new nest, to be a caterpillar in the heart of a flower, to be a jewel hiding itself inside a stone. I still arrive in order to laugh and to cry, in order to fear and to hope. The rhythm of my heart is the birth and death of all that is alive. I am the mayfly dancing on the surface of the river, and the bird which arrives in time to eat the mayfly. I am seen in the frog swimming happily in the clear pond, and in the grass snake who, approaching in silence, eats the frog. I am the child in Uganda, all skin and bones, my legs as thin as bamboo sticks. And I am the arms merchant selling weapons to Uganda. I am the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat, throwing herself into the ocean to avoid rape by pirates. And I am the pirate, my heart not yet capable of love. I am the cruel dictator with power in my hands, and I am the man dying slowly in a forced labor camp. My joy is like spring, so warm it makes flowers bloom. My pain is like a river of tears, so full it fills the four oceans. Please call me by my true names, so I can hear all my cries and laughs at once, so I can see that my joy and pain are one. Please call me by my true names, so I can wake up to all that I am and open the door of my heart to compassion. No wonder Martin Luther King recommended him for a Nobel Peace Prize. The book of Philippians talks about the Lord Jesus. Because when we recognize that our call is to go to the margins, to go to the least of these, when we recognize that that's our call, we see in Jesus the person who went there first. The book of Philippians says in chapter 2, verse 6, no, let's go from verse 1. If therefore any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any compassion and mercy, fulfill my joy, that you might be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord and one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or ambition, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem the other better than themselves. Let not every man think about his own things, but also the things of others. Verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God. And then what does your version say? Read me out. I've got the King James Version here. There are other versions. Does yours say, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped at? I like that. Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped at. I think already the word of God just comes and slices away at our hearts here when it says, let nothing be done out of strife, striving for this, striving for that, trying to get this, trying to get that. It says, let nothing be done out of that. Let nothing be done out of ambition. In a day when we raise ambition as a great virtue, Paul the Apostle says, let nothing be done out of striving and great ambition. No, have the heart of Jesus Christ, he says, who being in the form of God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped at, but he made himself of no reputation and took on himself the form of a servant and was made in the likeness of man. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself. Let me ask you this morning, beloved, when you see yourself in the mirror, and you might see yourself, you're a spirit enclosed in a body, and you say, hey, I am found in appearance as man. I am found in appearance as woman. I am found in appearance as a young person. I am found in appearance as an old person. What's your attitude to be as you find yourself in appearance as that? He says, you humble yourself. Take yourself of no reputation and humble yourself. And became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. You see, Jesus is going to the margins, started with him leaving heaven above and coming to earth below. It was founded in he knew who he was. He says, he being equal with God, he knew who he was. All the time, this little ego of yours is striving to be something. I've got to prove that I'm something. I've got to get letters after my name. I've got to get people adulating me. I've got to get more Facebook likes. I've got to get more people following me. I've got to get more YouTube hits. All the time, this little ego is doing that. You're missing who you really are, because who you really are needs none of that. Jesus, it says, he was in the form of God. Do you know you were created in the image of God? When you recognize the great I am that lives inside you, the little I am is no longer needed it doesn't have to vaunt itself. It doesn't have to climb a tree like little Zacchaeus trying to make something out of itself. He just says, no, it doesn't matter that I'm nothing. It doesn't matter that I flip burgers in McDonald's. It doesn't matter if I'm the prime minister. It doesn't matter if I'm really successful or if the world looks at me and says this person is homeless. It makes no difference whatsoever because I know who I am. And if I know who I am, then I am who the word says that I am. It matters little what you say I am. Because I know who I am, because I know I'm a son of God, I can humble myself. Because I know who I am, it doesn't matter if I clean the toilets. That don't matter. I don't care. You see, there's a scandal in the incarnation. The word incarnation is what we use to describe this, God becoming man. It's a scandalous thing. I think it's possibly that caused Satan to rebel in the first place when he realized that God was not content with creating the world and creating man, but God, having created all this, he has almost a fixation to want to become part of it, to become one with it. Incarnation, it literally means to be in flesh. Carne comes from the Latin word for meat, chili con carne, chili with meat. The incarnation means God becoming meat, flesh and blood. And there's a scandalous thing about this. Just think about this. We're going to be thinking about this when Christmas comes. Think about how scandalous it was for the great transcendent King of glory to come down and be born as a baby in a manger. How scandalous is that? That the God of glory is now soiling his nappy and cannot do anything about it and relies on a virgin called Mary to come and to sort him out afterwards and to burp him. What a scandal is that? I think the demons, the angels who rebelled, which we now know as demons, I think I can almost understand if that was the reason for their rebellion, when the Lord started laying it out here and saying to this great august assembly in the council chambers of heaven, as he gathers them together and he says, I am going to become incarnate. And they say, you must be kidding. You can't do that. You're God. You've got to be more respectable than that. We won't follow somebody who's incarnate. We're not going to follow man. We're not going to follow God in flesh. You're enthroned in glory. We fall down around your throne. The scandal of it. The scandal of a God who created the world and everything in it and created Adam and Eve and Mary and Joseph, and then looks up and some of the first words he says is mother, father, Abba to his earthly parents. What a scandal is that? That which he created now has authority over him. It says, Jesus, you come here. Jesus, go and clear up your room. That little incarnational child is now at the beck and call of fallen, sinful parents. The scandal of it all. But that's the incarnational nature of God. See, God is not just transcendent. He's not just wanting to be the God of glory up here, but there is a compulsion, if I can use that word, in the heart of God to enflesh himself, to enrobe himself in that which he's created. We see it in the words of Jesus. When his mother and his brothers come to get him, he's teaching and they're a bit concerned. He hasn't eaten for a while. He hasn't phoned home. He hasn't texted his mum for a long time. They come and see him. They say, Jesus, you're messing up your life. The wood shop needs to be cared for. Come back. There's work to do. And Jesus says, my brothers and my sisters. No, notice he doesn't say my subjects. He says, who are my brothers and my sisters and my mother, those who do the will of God? See, the transcendent God looks down and talks about subjects. You are my subjects. But the incarnational God comes down and looks at you mothers. Some of you here are mothers. You've had children who have died, perhaps. You've had children who no longer contact you, who you're estranged from. Perhaps things have gone so totally wrong in your lives and you're at the stage now and you look back and you say, oh, I long for the day when somebody called me mother. Can you believe that the incarnational God looks you in the eye and calls you mother, father? That's the scandal of it all. He looks at you and says, brother, sister. But it gets more than that. Jesus then takes the most common elements. He takes bread and he takes wine, and he said, I am the bread, I am the wine, I am the door, I am the shepherd, I am the poor person in the street, I am the least of these. When you see the woman with the issue of blood, his compassion goes out to her because he sees himself in her. This is the nature of incarnation. You see, the God who conceals himself in the mundane and the routine and the commonplace is still the God of glory. In the Old Testament, we see this. He comes and his glory dwells in a box we call the Ark of the Covenant. More glorious than that still, he comes and dwells in the hearts of men and women, fallen, broken men and women like you and like me. See, we miss God because we try to see him in the glorious and in the incredible and in the awesome. But God is found in the mundane and in the routine and in the commonplace. In Matthew 25, let's go there. And you know this parable, the parable of the sheep and the goats. And when the Son of Man, verse 31, shall come in all his glory, and the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory. And before him, so here we're talking about the transcendent God judging the world. But he judges it on the basis of what we do with the incarnational God. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit on the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate the one from another, as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right, but the goats he shall set upon his left. And if you know before we interbred sheep and goats, and the breeding programs of the last few hundred years, sheep and goats look pretty much identical. If you see a sheep that is a pure breed, it's almost identical to a goat. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference unless you were trained. He'll put the sheep on the right and the goats on his left, and the king shall say to them on his right hand, come ye, blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and we fed you? Or thirsty and gave you drink? When did we see you were a stranger and took you in? Or naked and clothed you? Or when were you sick and in prison and we came to you? And the king shall answer and say, verily I say to you, inasmuch as you've done it to the least of my brethren, you have done it unto me. It's the nature of the incarnation. We miss all these, and then he turns to the goats and he says the same thing. And they say, but when were you? And he says this. He says, I was hungry and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger and you took me not in. Naked and you clothed me not. Sick and in prison and you visited me not. And they will answer him saying, Lord, when were you hungry? When were you thirsty? When were you a stranger? When were you sick and in prison? And he will say, inasmuch as you did not do it to the least of my brethren, you did not do it unto me. And these shall go away to everlasting punishment, the scripture says. You see, you're not judged according to Jesus on what you do with the God of glory. You're judged with what you do with the God of incarnation. Yeah. With God in the neighbor, God in the person you've met, God in the homeless person, God in the hungry person, God in the person on the street, God, not God in the club where you go, not God in your gated community, but in the least of these, and we miss him every time. And we say, I can't see God. Where's God? Why can't I find God? And he's all around you, just looking in the wrong place. Mother Teresa said, in the poor we meet Jesus in his most deliberate disguises. So most distressing disguises. In the poor we meet Jesus in his most distressing disguises. The scandal of the incarnation is now thrown to us, and we are encouraged by Jesus to be scandalous people. You know, sometimes you hear, don't you, on the news, there's a great scandal. This person's created a scandal. That person's created a scandal. You and I are meant to be creating scandals wherever we go. Scandalous. A scandalous thing. Do you know what that pastor did? Do you know what that was all too sad that so many times these days the scandal is some moral failure, but that's ignored for the moral failure is far greater of the pastors and the teachers and the preachers and the church members and the people who come every week and sit on the pew and ignore the poor person sitting at the end of their street. Far greater scandal. So we are called, you and I, to be scandalous people and to be a scandalous church. The religious establishment in Jesus' day prioritized the wealthy. They prioritized the respectable. But Jesus prioritized the poor and the weak and the broken and the dispossessed. And he said, now my followers are going to do just the same thing. This is why the Salvation Army, when that started, General William Booth said, go for the lost, go for the broken, go for the poor, go for the people right on the bottom of the pile, because they're the ones who are going to listen to you. If you're here today and you gave up on yourself so long ago, I want to tell you, you're our priority. Amen. If you come here and you say, man, you've got no idea what I did with my life. You've got no idea how I've lived. It's okay, you're Jesus' priority. Jesus would rather be at your house than at the Archbishop of Canterbury's house. It's true. There's something about this scandalous Jesus. We find our mission on the margins, you see, because that's where we find Jesus. That's where he hangs out. He comes to church, but he hangs out on the margins. That's where you'll find him. When you come into with us and we go to the leper colony, that's where you find Jesus. When you look at the lepers in the eye, you see Jesus there, just radiant. When I was talking with Andrew, and he's in hospital and he's dying of cancer, and he's there, and I spoke to him and he said, I'm happier than I've ever been. He said, I have a home. He said, I have a home that I'm living. When I'm up 1 week in hospital, 1 week in my home. He said, when I'm at home, he said, I have a home. Well, he has a home because of the Workers' Sanctuary. At hospital, he says, I've got a family here. Bless him, Colin goes in and sees him all the time. He says, if ever I need something, Colin's there for me. He has a family. He has a home. And as I sat and talked with him, and he's lost so much weight now, and his hair has gone white. I saw in him the face of Jesus. Not because his life is the most morally pure person you'd ever find on the planet, but because I recognize the incarnational nature of God. Christ in you, Colossians says, Christ in you, the hope of glory. Let's go to Luke 14. In the 15th century, there was a monk. We know him as Francis of Assisi. He wasn't a monk at that time. He was just a Jack the Lad. He had everything. He was the son of a rich cloth merchant. And he had a dream. Went through a terrible, terrible illness. And during that time, it broke him, it changed him. Terrible things like that can change us. They change the way we perceive reality. And he came out of there, and one of the first things he did was see a leper. And when he saw that leper, he saw Christ in the leper. And he had been to church so many times. He was an upstanding member of the community. He had a seat right at the front of the church in days when most people didn't have seats in church. Most of the poor just came and sat on the floor or just stood there, and he had a seat. His family was well known by the bishop. And he saw a poor person. In that poor person, he saw Jesus, and he had never seen Jesus like that before, and it changed him. He walked out of Assisi, butt naked, and started a mission effectively to all those people that were poor and broken down and neglected and rejected by all the good and respectable Christians of his day. Scandal. The scandal of Assisi, the scandal of this young man who abandoned wealth, doesn't he know all the good he could have done with his riches? Doesn't he know all the wonderful things? He could have started a foundation. He could have done this. He could have done that. The scandal was he walked away because he said, unless I can identify with them, I can't reach them. He understood about Jesus. And a God who looked down for 2,000 years upon humanity and tried so desperately to communicate them and to love on them. And so poorly the Old Testament is a great story of the failure of God to be able to communicate with man. The great miracle is the scandal of Jesus coming in flesh, and all of a sudden communication is now open. He's become one of us. He said, I left heaven behind. That was the message of Philippians. He eschewed heaven. He said, I'm not having any of it. Leaving it all behind. And being found in appearance as man. He didn't even become a powerful rich man. He humbled himself and became a servant to the poorest of the poor. And that was the story of St. Francis. He said, I want my life to be an imitation of Christ. I leave all that. I don't want it. I don't want your accolades. I don't want your recommendations. I don't want good things written about me in the paper. I'm going to follow the Christ who's a scandal. And he left and became the scandal of Assisi. And by the time he had died, 10,000 people across the world were following in his footsteps. And today he's poster boy. And yet he was scandalous back then. It wasn't just him, of course. His first person who followed him was a young girl called Claire. A girl who saw exactly the same. Claire was actually looking after the lepers before he was. He despised her. And then he realized she was right all along. Look at this in Luke chapter 14, verse 16. And Jesus said unto them, a certain man made a great supper and bade many to come. You remember when Jesus said, when you make a feast, don't invite all your friends, don't invite all the rich and all the powerful. Don't invite all the people that you should have there, otherwise they're going to get offended with you. Don't invite he says, you go out and you invite the lowest of the low. You invite the people who never get invited to anything. Reality check. Think about the last 10 parties you've run. So Jesus says this, when you make a feast, verse 12. when you make a dinner or a supper, do not call your friends or your brethren, neither your kinsmen nor your rich neighbors, lest they also bid you again and a recompense be given to you. In other words, if you do that, they're going to ask you to go back. But when you make a feast, call the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind, and then you shall be the scandal of your community. For they cannot give you anything in return, but you shall be recompensed in the resurrection. Now, what he's asking us to do is what he did and what the Father did. You see, God don't want anything in return. Religion always wants something out of you. And when one of them, verse 16, then he said to them, a certain man made a great supper and bid many come. And he sent his servant at supper time to say to them that were invited, come, for all things are now ready. And they all with one consent began to make excuses. And the first said to him, I've bought a piece of ground and I must needs go and see it. I pray, let me be excused. Jesus talks about this 3 times in the Gospels. The excuses for not following Jesus. And they're all reasonable excuses. He sends a servant and says, come, church is at 11 o'clock. Just saying. Every week, not every other week, unless it's raining. And they all with one consent began to make excuses. The first said to him, I've bought a piece of ground and I must needs go and see it. Please let me be excused. His first excuse was business. Business. I remember I used to go to my pastor, Eddie, and I used to say, Eddie, I can't do this. I've got to work. And he used to say, change your job. What? You can't expect me to change a job. I have to work these hours and this is what I have to do. You say, change your job. Do it. But if you don't, I'm not going to be able to pay. If I do that, I'm not going to be able to pay my bills, Eddie. I can't do this and I can't. So don't pay. So cancel your bills. Cancel the things you can't afford. Follow the kingdom. And he was relentless about this. Relentless. And my mum and dad know Eddie. Many of you know Eddie. And he was driving at the time. He's driving an old Citroen Dolly, wasn't it? It was hysterical, this rust bucket round Margate. It was the scandal of the entire town, this car he would drive. But he followed his own teaching. He said, look, excuse me, I've got to look after this piece of ground. Verse 19, another one said, I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and I've got to go and prove them. Please let me be excused. That's the issue of see, the first one was work. The second one is wealth. Wealth is now his issue here. I've got to look after the business. I've got to be doing this stuff. I remember when Eddie told that to me, I took it away and I sought God and I came back and I became a window cleaner. What scandal is that? You're pastor of this respectable church. Clean windows. Like George Formby. And I tell you what, when I cleaned windows, I found Jesus there. I found him on the margins. Up that ladder, I'd clean windows. I'd often come back down, sit and have a cup of tea with somebody, the person I cleaned the windows for, and you'd end up talking about the Lord and ministering. Remember one time being at the top of the ladder and I'm singing my heart out to the Lord and I'm cleaning windows and somebody stops at the bottom of the ladder and they shout out, what must I do to be saved? Those exact words. I almost fell off my ladder. And another said, I bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to prove them. Let me be excused. And another said, I've married a wife. Therefore, I clearly cannot come. Got to get permission. Let me text her first. I'm going to be home late for dinner. No, I can't come. So that servant came and showed the Lord these things, and the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, go out quickly onto the streets and lanes of the city and bring in the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind. And the servant said, it is done, and they've come as you commanded, but there's still room. That's the amazing thing, isn't it? That's the incredible thing. People come when they're at the end. But then we get out of the gutter and all of a sudden we've got to spend all our time maintaining ourselves out of the gutter. Friend, it would be better for you to follow St. Francis and live your life in the gutter and follow him, follow Christ with all your heart and be free for him. Far better to do that than to build up the barns and build the kingdom of your own life and lose your soul.
Yes,
right. And the servant said, Lord, all is done, there's still room. In verse 23, the Lord said to the servant, get out on the highways and the hedges and compel them to come in, that my house might be filled. You see, Jesus is inclusive. He says, I want them all in. Many are called, but few allow themselves to be chosen. One translation of that verse says, the call goes out, we are just too busy. You see, the 21st century, the call is exactly the same. Jesus says, go at once. That's what the master said to the servant, go now, go now, go now, go now. And the reason he says go now is because the now reveals the problems that we've got to deal with in order to be Jesus' disciples. Go now, go now. You say, I want to be used by Jesus. Well, what if he said to you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I have somebody you've got to see now. Go and do that. Go and see them. What if he says to you, I need you to go to Margate and help the people. What? Go at once, no excuses. You see, there's no excuses. As we spoke this morning about being involved in Sanctuary, there's a number of things we're involved in. Sanctuary, these shifts, we need overnight shifts. We need people in the evenings. We need people overnight, and we need people in the mornings to cook breakfast for these guys. I watch the same people doing it again and again and again and again. And churches are like football matches sometimes with a few dozen people desperately in need of rest, being watched and cheered on by thousands of people desperately in need of exercise. Yeah. You see, there's no excuse. Every excuse that they bring to Jesus, Jesus says it's not valid. It's not valid. It's not valid. It's not valid. My call on your life trumps everything. That's his call on our life. Well, here's an opportunity to serve. I would love to be able to say to the churches in our area that every single person in our church serves in some way to the least of these. Whether that's working in the school pastors, as a street pastor, going to Wombwell Hall, helping with food bank, but particularly today, Sanctuary. Thank you. We were coming back from street pastors. Sorry, this will need to be wiped afterwards. We were coming back from street pastors on Friday night, and we were in the early hours of the morning, and Joe and I, you're preaching next week, aren't you? Yeah, that's it. It's okay, I'll sterilise it for you. And we're coming back, and we're driving, we finished our shift, we're looking forward to going home, looking forward to a cup of cocoa, bed, sleep. And as we're driving home, we saw a lady. Her name's Joanne. Funny, but Joanne. And as we're driving home, we saw her sitting on the floor just by the side of the chip shop. And there were people outside the chip shop, and they were eating and ignoring her. And she's sitting there in tears with her hair all bedraggled, some clothes just thrown on, bare feet, with a bag in her hand. And everything within us said, just ignore it, go past, you've done your bit, go home, go to bed. And I said to Joe, we can't stop, we can't not stop. And so we pulled up and we got out and we went down there. And that's something you shouldn't, street pastors, once you're off duty, you're not meant to be going out, but we went and we sat with her. We went up to her, we said, are you okay? And she said, yeah, I'm fine. Of course she wasn't fine. And so we sat down on the floor with her, and we said, look, what's the story? What's happened? And she said, well, I live in this flat behind me. She says, my husband beats me up every night. She says, see the broken windows and the broken door? That's when he gets angry, he smashes everything, and if I'm in the way, he smashes me. He has a restraining order on him, but he just keeps coming back. She says he came back tonight and I had to get out, otherwise he would have beaten me up. And she's sitting there just with a few possessions and bare feet. Cold night. And you see Jesus in her. And Jesus was sitting there with bare feet, with his hair all over the place, having been beaten by a man. We don't know the whole story. Maybe she's difficult to live with, I don't know. But I do know this, that we couldn't leave. And we sat with her for a while and we said, look, why don't we come in with you? What if we go in with you and talk with him? And we spoke for a while and in the end we got her details and she went in and maybe we'll be able to help her. I'm going to talk to you, Lorna, see if we can help this woman. But you see, when you see Jesus in everything, you can't do it. You can't but do something about it. And that's why compassion flows out, and going to the margins and having time to listen to this woman. She had had a few drinks, listen to her slurred story, flows out of recognizing there's no essential difference betwixt her and me. He says, go to the margins. So, as we close this morning, I don't know about you, but the one thing I want to hear is, well done, good and faithful servant. I'm not interested in being shiny for Jesus, keeping this respectable exterior. The challenge to you I want to leave you with is, will you spend your life in the respectable center or the disreputable periphery? Will you be part of the respectable in crowd, or are you confident enough in who you really are as a son or daughter of God to be able to go to the disreputable periphery? Because Jesus has already told you where you're going to find him. That's where you'll find him. He's laboring there. Will you let him labor alone? Or will you go and roll up your sleeves and say, Lord, I'm going to help? And here's a great opportunity. We've presented you with this immediate opportunity now. And you might say, that's unfair, that's pressure. Read the words of Jesus. Read the parables. Jesus knows how to turn up the pressure. I'm turning up the pressure this morning. I'm not asking for anybody to sign up to something that they're not willing to do, that they're just going to let people down on. Don't do that. But I want you to now, as we pray right now, say, Lord, what is the margin you want me on? I've still got to earn a crust. That's okay. God knows that. He understands that. I may still have to plow a field. I may still have to go and work for the man during the week. I may still have to do this, that, and the other. But what is God calling me to? Where is the periphery that Jesus is waiting for me, where he currently labors alone? Let's take a moment.